Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for hopping onto the call today, middle of the week, Wednesday, hump day. Always a good moment, I think, to jump on a webinar and do some learning. I want to thank everyone who's joined. Filed Live is always a conversation with those at the convergence of data privacy, data security, data regulation, records, and governance. If you don't know who I am, I'm Anthony Woodward, the CEO of RecordPoint. And today I'm joined by Wanne Pemmelaar, who's the CEO and co-founder of filerskeepers. How are you, Wanne?
I'm fine, and thanks for having me. It's always good to kind of cut the week in half with a webinar.
Absolutely. And what part of the world are you joining us from today?
The Netherlands. So it's actually 9 p.m. here. I'm often working from early European time zone to late American time zone. So that's it.
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you for jumping on. I'm sitting in Seattle, so it's a perfect 12:01 p.m. here, and lovely day outside for Seattle. In fact, look, Wanne, we've been talking a whole bunch, and in fact, we both just come off a bunch of different conferences that we happen to spend some time together at. There's been a lot of conversation going on. What do you see that's really happening in that landscape? Reflecting back on those conferences and the conversations, what's the big topics that customers and stakeholders are talking to you about?
So everybody, of course, is talking about AI. That's kind of like the hot and happening new thing. What I find very interesting is that, I've seen many customers who just want to flip the switch on their Copilot in Microsoft and just, see the magic happen basically. And then I always wonder, but how about the basics? How's, your privacy posture? How's your data security? How's your records management? Aren't you just holding on to a whole lot of records and data? And, maybe in a few months, you'll be confronted with a big mess. I was very pleased to learn that during those conferences, there were definitely a few sensible companies that said, let's hold off on the Copilot thing. Let's clean up our team sides and our SharePoints and everything, and let's then turn it on, because that will be way more powerful. So that's something that I noticed. And what I found interesting, especially in the records management conferences, was that more and more it's about privacy, which I think is very interesting, because privacy is kind of changing the records management landscape. I think for the better, to be honest. We're going from just archiving to balancing risks and adhering to laws from a minimum perspective, but also from a maximum perspective. You need to let go of your records at one point. Yeah.
No, great. And one of the themes I heard a lot about as well was people looking at this convergence. So what were previously viewed as kind of, there was records and that was a discipline. There was privacy and that was a discipline. There was data and that was a discipline. What AI, but I think also other trends in the industry is causing us to do is to really look at the convergence of these things, not necessarily as a single entity, but certainly as a very closely related, interrelated set of disciplines. Did you observe that at all?
Yeah, so I think the trend is now, hey, let's try to bring together our data governance, our privacy, our data security, and our records management teams together in one organization. That's very forward thinking, by the way. Yeah, so we in practice, we don't really see it, but that often yet. But what I find also very interesting is in kind of like the Commonwealth and the US, there is a discipline of records management. There's almost no such thing in Europe. No, you have privacy teams, data security teams, and then people go like, where's our records management expert, by the way? And that nowadays lands on the desk of privacy and maybe even more so on whomever just touches the topic, basically gets it thrown in their lap. So yes, we see convergence. We also see that, in some regions, there's a whole lot of catching up to do. And for example, so what filerskeepers does basically is we read all the laws in the world, and then we take from their rules that tell companies how long they should store their records and data, and then we help apply those rules to the records and data of our clients by building retention schedules, global retention schedules, and we can help and make risk-based decisions around that. What's your most optimal retention periods if you have 50 countries to kind of manage, and it's just too overwhelming to implement 10,000 different rules into your systems. But also, how do you keep that up to date so we can send a ping when the law changes? And by doing this, we attract organizations from everywhere in the world, basically, whether they're from Australia, Brazil, or the US or Europe. And what we now see, for example, in countries where they have recently issued a new privacy law, is that they are not interested in records management whatsoever. They're just focusing on hitting, kind of like ticking the boxes on like, I need to get my ROPAs and records of processing activities in order. I need to do impact assessment. I need to have published a privacy statement. But then 2-3 years later, that's where we see, oh, records management, it's that one unticked box. And we need to now, for example, a lot of interest now from Brazil, which, have been working on their new privacy law for a while, basically.
Yeah, and it's super interesting what you all do there at filerskeepers. This notion of having a consolidated set of regulations that are constantly maintained, and people can access that and then look at the subsequent disposal schedules and how they should treat that data. You mentioned that you're doing that globally. Have you got every country in the world covered, both from a privacy and a records lens? Or what's the scope of that?
Yeah, so basically what we do is we read all the laws in a country or state, and we read them from A to Z, or from 2024 all the way back to the very first law that we can find that's still in force. And we've done that for all the countries in the world at national level. And we have over 100 states now in our database. So think of everything in the US, Canada, Australia. But did you know that Brazil has 25 plus states, and so does Nigeria and Switzerland? So we're still catching up, but we basically always, and this is how we did it over the past 5 years, we always go where the need is. So if our clients tell us, you now need to do Switzerland, we will focus on Switzerland, basically.
No, great. What's the gamut of that? Is it focused on privacy and GDPR and those things, or is it really focused more on records retention? Like, where do you sort of stop and finish?
Yeah, so my co-founder and I both are global data protection lawyers. So we come originally from privacy, and it was also we were working at a top tier law firm here in the Netherlands. And one day a client came to us and said, hey, can you please let us know what the retention rules are in 78 countries? And we tried, we failed. We engaged 60 law firms, and they were completely stuck because this was taking up way more resources than they had hoped for. You can ask law firms a lot of questions, but please don't ask them to read all the laws in their country in search of a few retention periods. So we had to write off a whole lot of cost for cost going over budget. So that was the moment that we looked at each other and said, this needs to be a product, not a service, basically. And that's how we started. So our basis is in privacy. So naturally, we look at guidance from privacy regulators. We look at the privacy laws that often are very unhelpful. It says usually keep this no longer than necessary for the purposes for which you have collected or are processing the data. But what we also noticed was it was basically all those other laws that actually contain minimum, maximum retention periods or statute of limitations that could be good inspiration. And this is where every single law may have a retention period. And why is that? Well, very often when a lawmaker makes a new law, say it's an environmental law, then they go like, okay, how do we make sure that organizations actually adhere to those laws? Well, you know what? We'll just put in a minimum requirement to keep the records so that when we do an audit, at least, we know for sure that there is something there to be checked, basically. So that's how this started. Now, what the privacy laws do, at the same time. So if you have a minimum requirement of, say, keep this record 5 years, the privacy laws then say keep it no longer than necessary. So that can be in accordance with the law, of course. That kind of makes every minimum almost a maximum if personal data is involved. Meaning you need to have a very good reason to kind of keep the records beyond the minimum retention period. So this is something that it kind of influences each other, basically. So we always jokingly say our database, of course, you should use it to kind of inform yourself on how long you need to keep certain records. But we also know thousands, hundreds of thousands of reasons why you are allowed to keep data, under privacy laws. So because you have to, basically, So,
and that's super interesting. We at RecordPoint think a lot about how you automate the application of those regulations to data. We don't obviously do the work that you do on the regulation side, but there's a lot of shift in people's expectations of how those regulations should be applied, and some more modernization of legislation out there to think about, and even case law to think about how organizations should handle data and what are the processes, even pre-disposal. Are you seeing that, particularly as we think about the privacy implications, some of the changes that even happened, in the CPA-RA requirements in California, a year back? What are you seeing those trends occur and the big kind of movements around that data management capability?
Yeah, so you touch upon a few points here, which I'm kind of like battling in my head where I'll start. Let's start with the last thing you said on the CPRA. So let's just talk about how things are shifting in the US and in Canada, especially. So traditionally, the US and Canada are very light on privacy laws, basically. CPRA has changed that. So now you suddenly have a full-fledged GDPR-style privacy law at state level in California. The original CCPA just had a requirement that, if someone was complaining about you keeping data, you would have to delete at a request the data. But then that was not enough. And with the ballot initiative, when they voted in Biden, at the same time, there was a ballot initiative to kind of up the level of protection. And in there, that it became the CPRA. And there was the requirement to keep data no longer than necessary. And that's a huge shift. It was the first of its kind in the US. And there's more happening there. But let's start with how would you build a retention schedule before the CPRA kicked in? You would basically look at all the rules in all the states, and you would pick the longest minimum, because that makes sense. So if there is a rule in Minnesota that says 10 years and it happens to be the longest in the US, you would pick that to inspire the retention of whatever, let's say some technical factory records or something. And then suddenly now the CPRA comes into effect and it says no longer than necessary. So you cannot go to the Californian regulator and say, hey, there is this rule in Minnesota that tells me to keep something for 10 years. They will go, no, you have to adhere to the Californian privacy law. That says 3 years. So you're going to keep it 3 years here. So it's going to make it very complex in the US if you get like this patchwork of privacy laws telling you to keep things no longer than necessary to know what to adhere to. The US, at the moment, filerskeepers has over 300,000 legal citations. The US accounts for 100,000, so 1/3 those rules. So it's going to be very, very complex. Now, what we see is that the FTC has woken up to the notion of records retention. And what they basically say, and that they've issued several enforcement cases, is first of all, you have to have a retention schedule. So you need to have a policy which determines how long you need to keep your retention, or you need to keep your records. You need to be transparent about that policy. So you need to even publish it online. You can't just say, oh, I'm keeping this no longer than necessary in accordance with the law. That's not specific enough. You have to publish this. And they really believe that. And what is the basis for that? It's their Section 5 of the FTC Act, which basically is a provision against unfair trade practices. So they start reading this whole privacy law now in their own Section 5 of the FTC Act. And they really mean it, because they do have some kind of like policy making and lawmaking powers. So now, for instance, for the COPPA, so the Children Online Privacy Protection Act, there are some regulations, which I think, I don't know how you pronounce that, maybe COPPER. They actually say we want a no longer the necessary requirement in there now. Yeah, so that would be the first US federal rule that would have that. So long story short, no longer the necessary is creeping into the US law. Similar trends are we can see in Canada. Yeah, sorry.
Well, no, I was going to say, you're about to answer it. Are you seeing that trend globally? People probably can tell from my accent. I'm from Australia. Brand new legislation coming into Australia, the Australian Parliament. There's an exposure draft out that absolutely has that and pretty much echoes what we're seeing both in California and out of the FTC. But what's happening in the rest of the world that you're observing?
The rest of the world kind of goes further than the US. Yeah, so the US is still very, consumer oriented when it comes to their privacy protection. That's the fun thing that I see now in Canada. I have very interesting conversations with Canadian partners and friends and clients, where you see the shift from traditional consumer protection to more employee protection. And that's a real shift in mindset, basically. So the rest of the world basically tends to adopt the GDPR style privacy law. So they kind of use that as a blueprint. It's omnibus. It applies to everyone, consumers, employees, but also, people working for a legal entity. Everybody deserves some degree of privacy. So it has a way broader application. And I think what's now happening is that the train has left off, and we're now creating all those add-ons, for, Digital Markets Act, Services Act, AI Act, Data Act, all these add-ons, and you quickly now see the onset on those rules. And maybe if I may, to touch on the AI Act in the EU, which was recently agreed on. It has not yet been officially published. It's adopted, but it hasn't been published. It will be in May or June. It contains 25 records retention requirements, just to give you an idea. Yeah, so all around transparency and conformity and all of that. So, and what could happen, is that you could be slapped with a GDPR fine and then slapped with another AI Act fine, because there are two different laws, and they do technically regulate something else. So there's a whole lot of development there. So I think that the rest of the world is that's where it's headed. So it will be these, I think you start with the privacy law, and then you will you will start regulating the data market and the AR market, basically. Yeah.
Absolutely. And do you see with that complexity that there's beginning to be some best practices around how to approach this? Because the reality of, I think, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, there really is some commonality in those laws. And as you said, there's different maturities in different jurisdictions, but it is starting to come to a common point. And it's not actually all common around the GDPR principles. There are some Uber principles that come into use of data, and the AI Act is a great example of that in Europe. But we're seeing other regulation happen in South America and other Asian countries as well around the regulation of AI. How do you see all this coming together? Like, where's the, for those that are listening or listening to the podcast later, what should they be thinking about as kind of the end game and the criteria they should be constructing?
Yeah. So let's start by the fact that regulators and legislatures around the world are dead serious about these acts. Yeah. And every day almost, like I said, it came from privacy, and I looked at the live stream when the GDPR was voted into law by the European Parliament in 2016, and it didn't matter who the speaker was or what political party, or there was one message they had for everyone in the world, and that was real compliance, and they kept repeating it over and over and over. So they're really serious about real compliance. And let me tell you what I think is necessary to achieve real compliance. And then I can also tell you what the stress test would look like, if confronted with a regulator, and then you can kind of judge for yourself where you think you stand. So first of all, we see that companies, when it comes to records retention, they have three problems. The first one is not knowing the law. So what we can help with that. But the moment you do know the law, you get completely overwhelmed with the number of rules. And so you have to make choices. And that's the second problem. How do you make choices when laws are conflicting? And the one law says keep this minimum 5 years, and then maximum 5 years, and the next one says keep this minimum 50 years. You can't comply with everything at the same time. You have to deploy a risk-based approach. And then the moment you have made your choices, how do you then implement that into a very complex IT landscape? And I think you guys can talk way more about that. But, our kind of like goal is to kind of connect, the laws and the choices around the law to the systems, and to make sure that we connect to companies like RecordPoint to make sure that we make this real, and we are actually managing the life cycle effectively and on the basis of real information and that you can rely on. So that I think that last part is going to be a huge project. Can you imagine? You have to face all the challenges that those companies face: cloud on premise, current legacy, structured, unstructured, proprietary, third party, but also just traditional hard copy digital, right? Still a lot of paper that we keep everywhere. So we need to kind of overcome those challenges. And then, as to my point, like what would a stress test look like? I've litigated the topic of data retention under EU privacy law. I've seen the red spots in the necks of the regulators. And one time I had a situation where I was assisting a client, and they were a digital television provider. And then there was a breach. It came in the news. There was a privacy regulator that stepped in and did their investigation. So they would do a dawn raid, would come, and they would say, open up the application. And then so someone would just open the application. They were like, no, I don't want to see the front end. I want to see the database. So then you have to open up the database, and it will go line by line. What's that data about? Why are you keeping this? Who has access to it? How long are you keeping this? Well, any company will fail at that level if you really look at that level of detail. So then, with the question, how long are you keeping this? Our client said, well, 6 months, which I thought was a pretty reasonable retention period, to be honest. It was around viewer data, of the television shows that they broadcast. And then the regulator asked, why? And they said, well, because we can maybe expect some questions around our broadcast. And they were like, prove it. So then the client went back, did their due diligence. We were very nervous. We were giving a timeline of 2 weeks. And I think 1.5 weeks later, they came back to us and said, we got one. Here's a lady that had a question about a certain program 4 months after the broadcast. And we took that back to the regulator, and the regulator responded by saying, congratulations, you have now built a case for a 4-month retention period. That is going to be your new retention period. So the moral of the story is, you need to also invest in use cases. If your data matters to you, if your records matter to you, and you are faced with a no longer than necessary scenario, and your data analyst would be without a job if you don't have the data, and you can get that order for deletion, then invest in a case around necessity. Try to prove your business need. Say, I need this for 10 years because my product lifecycle is 10 years. Prove that your product lifecycle is 10 years. Then play devil's advocate. Say, what if we were to only keep it 5 years? So you ask your business, what if we just 5 years? You're no longer allowed to keep it longer than 5 years. Then they would say something breaks. Okay, what would break? Can you show that to me? Can you prove it quantitatively, through statistics, or qualitatively through an example? The moment you do that, you're not only proving the business need, but you're also proving necessity. Yeah, because you're proving that something goes wrong if you would keep it shorter. And I think that you shouldn't do that for every single record or data type. It's way too much work. But for your very important data warehouses and data lakes, I think that would make a lot of sense. Yeah. So, yeah.
And I think it's worth saying, right, as you talk, not just those in the discipline here of privacy and records and that in those areas, as executives and CEOs and boards really talk, and I've been in some of these conversations, I know you have as well, around how data is the oil of business, right? It's what makes the machine run. We need the data to do that. It is, and I use this analogy a lot with people, really thinking about having a car that runs on with oil in the engine. You need to tune it up. You need to continue to replace it. You need to continue to think about, what is occurring, how you can best treat that engine if it's, been through hot weather or cold weather and all those kind of variables. The same applies here to data, right? In terms of the analogy we draw for boards around thinking about how you're retaining that oil. What is the key oil that we're going to have in different parts of the engine? How do you treat that differently? And what are those processes? And where that really comes back, I think, very much as you just said, that stress test is, are we clagging the engine up? Are we doing things that are wrong for different stakeholders because we're not looking after those elements well? And I think that's very much the message that we're giving to people is it is now a whole system. It's not just there's a privacy stack. There's a bunch of people that run data. There's a bunch of people that think about records. These things converge, and they converge both. The regulation expectation is convergence, right? And I think that's where, both us at RecordPoint and yourselves at filerskeepers really come together to explain that story very effectively.
Yeah, and I think it was the New Zealand deputy privacy commissioner a few years ago that said data retention is the sleeping giant of data security. Or cybersecurity. So yeah, everything is connected. And if you don't have a whole lot of data, the breach is smaller once you get hacked. Yeah. So yes, I agree. And I like the analogy with the oil and the motor. If you just have oil in a barrel, it does represent some value, but the moment you put it in a machine, that's when it really, creates something. So yeah, I believe very much. And this is also why those cybersecurity rules, those privacy rules, those AI rules are so incredibly important. Yeah. If I talk to Chinese people, they're saying that there's a Chinese cybersecurity authority, the CAC, is the most powerful regulator in China now. Yeah, for various reasons. But what I believe is, okay, so there are no real IP rights in data. Yeah. If I could license you the use of my name, I would love to do that, but it's impossible. So the mechanism, that we used to have until like 20 years and maybe GDPR, 5 years ago, 6, there was no real meaningful mechanism to regulate data. And then the GDPR came, and now the AI Act comes. Yeah. So those are the mechanisms that are actually regulating the new oil of our industry. And that's why, when such an act is proposed or a bill is proposed in any parliament, it gets lobbied to death, basically, almost. In the EU, they literally had to lock themselves up in the building of the Commission at one point, and throw out all the lobbyists because they were not getting anywhere. Because in Parliament they submitted 3,500 amendments, and in the Commission Council, I think they did like 350 or something. So the whole process was stuck, and that's why. And that's why when you read those laws, AI Act, GDPR, it feels like a compromise, and that's true. So yes, everything comes together, and I like the way I think the lawmakers are seeing this, and they are kind of like coordinating their efforts around cybersecurity, AI, and privacy. I see that the industry is seeing it. Yeah, we see more integrated products and things that are useful for different teams to come and work together on. It's now, I think, the industry that needs to kind of reorganize itself a little bit more. And yeah, we're getting there, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, little by little. It's interesting, even that quote you gave from the Deputy Privacy Commissioner in New Zealand. I was at a presentation that was very late last year. I think that quote you're talking about was earlier in the year. And she'd actually changed the quote to say that it was no longer the sleeping giant, but in fact was the awake giant of cybersecurity, because we certainly saw through last year, and we won't go through all the examples here in this conversation, but example after example of retention of data resulting in large privacy breaches around the globe, right? Where, the last stat I saw from McKinsey was there was something like 100 million people globally that had their data, over retained and exposed from organizations. And I think that's what's driving regulators to think more and more about these problems.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I believe that data deletion or records deletion, destruction, is the ultimate sign of trust. Yeah. So it's basically when you tell your stakeholders, your customers, employees, we will let go of your data because we feel that your privacy, security, and well-being is more important than our short-term economical gain. Yeah. So the fact that you can actually say, I dare to delete. Yeah. We even have a t-shirt, I dare to delete data. We hand them out during conferences, but that is a real sign of that trust. And we have done a bit of a survey with another company, and it actually showed that if you are actively deleting data and you are transparent about it, because you do need to brag about it, you can increase consumer trust with 50%. So, the fact that I got hacked, but I didn't have your data anymore. So, there was nothing to share is something that people really, really appreciate. It's very scary because it's against human nature. We are by origin hunter-gatherers, we need to gather the items to survive. Yeah. And the same goes for information. The same goes for records. I've had so many discussions, and people can get super attached to their data. I was, as a lawyer, I once represented a client who was the biggest retailer here in the Netherlands, and they had a loyalty program. And the loyalty program came in the news, parliamentary questions asked, boom, privacy investigation. And one of the issues was retention. And I was looking at kind of like the batch files and everything. And I was sitting there with the data analyst, and I said, okay, so this should go. How old is it? 25 years. And I said, this should go. And he said, no, but, and he started crying. And I said, what's wrong? And then he said, well, I was there, when we started the loyalty program. These are the first 500 people that signed up. In about 3 years, it was 20 years, sorry. And then in about 3 years, when there's the 25-year anniversary, that will be the year that I'm going to have my retirement. And I wanted to do like this special thing with the original 500 people who signed up, right? He was so attached to it. And I said, sorry, dude, it has to go. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's scary. I know.
It is hard, right? It's hard to know what to keep and what to let go of, and that's why these rules exist. Look, one final question from me, and then we'll get to some questions from the audience. What if you were to summarize this all up? What is it that you think would be the one or two things leaving this conversation you would tell someone to go away and do today? If they could do nothing but those things, what would that look like?
So I think I've made the point already that you need a retention schedule, so I will not make that point. Yeah. But I think if you really want to manage your records and data properly, start by building in the basics. So the first thing you need to do is you have to have a very serious legal hold process. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you need to have a system where you say, it's silly, but with deletion and destruction, you need to cater for the exception first. So you need to be able to preserve evidence should you be compelled to. So that could be there's a litigation or threaten a litigation, and we now need to preserve the proof. We need to freeze it, and we need to make sure that if we implement retention in our system, systems, that we can kind of supersede that, because when it's gone, and we can't preserve it anymore. Yeah, so that's the first thing, I guess. And the second thing is, I would say, make an assessment, prioritize. You cannot fix your entire IT landscape like that. You need to look at it seriously. You need to look at where are your biggest risks. What do you need to fix first? And be realistic. This is going to be a project that I think is bigger than any privacy or AI project will be. Yeah. And it's fundamental to anyone with AI ambitions. So it's better, start now or fail very soon. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing advice. So we did have please, if anyone on the call would like to post a question in, please do so now. But we do have a first question in the chat for Yvonne. And the question was, what's the name of the document that has the 25 records management references, which I believe was the new AI Act, new AI legislation, rather, because it's no longer an act in Europe.
Yeah, and it's the new EU AI Act. Unfortunately, it's still a little bit hard to find because the European Parliament published one version of the final text, which they agreed on, but they're saying we now need to, in EU fashion, translate that into 25 different languages or something, and then they're going to publish it. And then from there, it will enter into effect, I think, 2 months later. And then you will have between 6 months and 3 years to comply with it, depending on what kind of AI you deploy. Yeah. Is it going to be applicable to you if you're not in the EU? Big chance. Yeah. If you look at the applicability, it's almost like if you know someone that is affected, then it applies to you. That's kind of like my very, very broad interpretation of it, but you should read it yourself. It's most likely applicable. And in there, you have 25 records retention obligations. Yeah. Rules to tell you to keep your risk assessments, your conformity statements, yeah, your logic, yeah, your training data. Some of them have a retention period of 10 years. Some of them are unspecified, yeah, but it's all in all 25 rules. Yeah.
No, it's fantastic. And I only can speak and read English, but luckily it is in English and I have read it. So I know you can do 100 different languages, Wanne, and you're far more sophisticated than me, but luckily I did read it in that form.
I applaud you because only the recitals alone are, I think, 150 pages. So, and then you haven't even gotten to the real act. So it's a big document. Yeah.
Look, I think for both of us, one of the burdens we get to carry is to read these different pieces of legislation as they come out across the globe. But bizarrely, I don't mind doing that. That's okay.
And well, bizarrely, I don't either, as we read all the laws in the world. So yeah.
Great. If there's any last questions for anyone else in the audience to bring through, happy to answer those now and just give you a moment to pull that in. Wanne, this has been an amazing conversation. I could probably talk to you for hours, but I realize it's getting late there and you probably want to go to bed at some point. The big takeaway, I think, for most of the audience is there is a lot of different legislation. It's changing really rapidly. It is difficult to stay on top of this. And I think, what's amazing around what you're doing at filerskeepers and why we're really excited to be working with you here at RecordPoint is you're solving that problem. And that's a huge pain point for customers. So look, thank you for the conversations we've been having. There's no new questions that have come into the chat. So we'll probably wind up there. But, really enjoyed the time and look forward to when we catch up again soon.
Awesome. Well, maybe I can add to that when I started the company, I had like a moonshot slogan and I said, let's solve records retention once and for all. And when you say this, you can do this for any problem in the world, basically. And so it's almost a bit cheesy, but I think the people who are in records management understand what we mean. I'm very optimistic. We started off by reading all the laws in the world. People told us that can't be done. We did it. Now I think we need to just fix it into all the, in the whole IT landscape. I'm very positive. My prediction is that maybe in like 3 years, we have got this thing under control. So, and I think now I can see it, how we would do that. And definitely through a partnership like we have with RecordPoint. So that's awesome.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Have a good rest of your evening and night. And thank you, everybody who's jumped on the live broadcast and those that catch up with Filed Live later on. I'm Anthony Woodward. Thank you very much for tuning in. This has been an episode of Filed Live.